we're pretty much on track in terms of our agenda. And the next element on the agenda is some reaction by our past presidents. I think that we will go in reverse order. Since is Ben here? Since Ben is not here, then do you have anything to add?
I think I've said enough.
Okay. Then, Bruce, what do you have to add as the next most recent past president?
I've said, I think, enough.
Okay, okay. Dale, you are the next in line. What do you have to add to the... Well, Bruce took a pass. It shocked me to death. But first of all, you weren't in the room when I said how grateful I am for you guys giving us the use of your room without your normal $450 charge. So it really is wonderful that we have you and Kemper Development Company as sponsors or supporters or whatever the word should be. But in terms of the takeaways that you have from today's presentations on preservation and maintenance, what words of wisdom do you have for us?
We've got to be careful trying to pick winners and losers about the different modes, because you're going to alienate at least one or two people. We've got to really start thinking more system, and we really do need to bear in on preservation and maintenance more than competing modes. That's a big enough problem. We've got holes in the bridge advantage. We've got Magnolia Bridge. Every one of us has a project. We've got the I-5 crossing. That's a huge thing that could happen any moment. So I think we need to pick and start, as an organization, kind of focus in on the preservation piece. If we're going to continue to grow this, it's a common thread amongst all of us, is the preservation and maintenance. And we'll get lost in the weeds and start eating on each other when we start trying to pick winners and losers between transit and bikes and freight mobility. And that's kind of my takeaways, is just focus on what unites us more than the competing for the resources out there that have just been diminished with the passage of I-976. So that's my 2 cents.
Last night at our officers and past presidents meeting, although we had a place for you and you didn't come until this morning, we had a good conversation, and Dale pointed out at the time, because it was quite disputatious, a word that we all learned last night. And Dale pointed out that preservation and maintenance is something that we all can support and agree on. And I think that remaking that point today is useful, because there are a million things that need to be done. But the whole system relies on being there. And I just want to share with you, there's been some really interesting scholarship that's been coming out of Europe that are using these night images from space to analyze economic development in Europe and North Africa. And these scholars out of Holland have identified the fact that the difference between North Africa, which had Roman roads, because Rome built a road system across North Africa, and the economic activity in Europe that had Roman roads, is the fact that the European roads were maintained and improved over time, and the North African roads were not. And so when you look at the Mediterranean from space at night, what you see is that immense investment that Caesar made 2,000 years ago in North Africa is just gone. And with the exception of, a handful of port cities in North Africa that are not connected at night with economic activity, they're just black. The difference between the investment that was made in Europe and has been an impetus for economic progress for 2,000 years, and in North Africa, where it was not maintained, is literally the difference between light and darkness. And we have to keep, I think we really have to, among other things, be looking for the right metaphor to convey the realities to people who don't spend their time on a Thursday afternoon sitting in a room like this talking about preservation and maintenance. They've got lives to live. They're going to get back on bad roads tonight and try to drive home. But we have to find a metaphor that will get us there. And so I really appreciated Dale's distilling the reality of last night's arguments down to the fact that the one thing we kept coming back to that we could all agree on is the centrality of roads and the importance of maintaining them. The next person in line, I guess, is you.
I don't really have anything to add.
Well, I thought your presentation was excellent, so that there's no reason. In fact, I thought all the presentations today were excellent. I really want to thank the presenters and Scott, who probably should have been a presenter because he was anyway. Bob?
I was really amazed at all of the different ways that we are going to have to, what we have to do to solve this problem. I should get ahead of that. We've got a problem, and the problem is going to get worse. People aren't going to move to North Africa until they fix the roads. But I think everybody here says the first thing we have to do is to take care of the roads we have. And I've learned a lot.
Well, you've taught us a lot as well. I'd like to just conclude with saying that we've identified several things here today that could be part of the solution. And I've forgotten exactly who mentioned the fact that the gas tax is not indexed, unlike any of our other major taxes in the system. And that obviously is something that can be resolved in one session of the legislature or by one initiative. I mean, it's not a complex issue to deal with. Because people rely on roads, they're going to understand, with the exception of Tim Iman, who has a reason not to understand. They're going to understand that if you want the damn thing to work, you have to pay for it. So it seems to me that's one thing that was identified here as a part of the solution. The other thing is the fact that we could propose a gas tax that is dedicated exclusively to preservation and maintenance, and a gas tax increase that would go for that purpose and not others. At other presentations we've had, we have heard from Ashley Probart, Tib, about the fact that informally legislative staff used to build preservation and maintenance funding into its capital improvement projects, and that has sort of dropped by the wayside. And that could be institutionalized so that if you have a $1 billion project, you have to build in $100 million for the preservation and maintenance of that project from the get-go. And leave the details aside about whether or not you bank it or you do this or you do that. But the fact of the matter is that could be another part of the solution. The Vanpool expansion potential for getting greater utilization of the road system is certainly something that's there. Technology could be part of the solution, although I'm listening from people who actually thought about this, that may not be for another couple decades. Another thing that could be a piece, and it's also a decade or so away, is the nickel gas tax is scheduled to expire when those projects are completed and paid for.
They're not going to be paid for 40 years.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's another decade or so. But the fact of the matter is that money could be, before they're paid for, dedicated to preservation and maintenance when the funds become available. But I would urge you, if you have more ideas now that we can put on the list, that would be great. But think about, and one other thing that came up during the break is somebody came up and suggested, why is it that we are not licensing or leasing out our rest areas. And, you know, just as Kemper has gotten rich by his triple net leases, you know, we could be earning our percentage rent on the McDonald's stands at the rest areas. So, again, I'm not saying that's a completely worthy idea, but it's something that we need to look at, because we need to look at all of these solutions. We're not going to get to 20 or 40 or however many billions of dollars it's going to be without at least looking at everything that's out there. So I think we talk all the time about the fact that if you don't re-roof your house, or your office or your buildings every 5 years on a rotating basis, that you're going to come to a problem. But I'm starting to think that our problem is more akin to why people put off going to the dentist. People don't go to the dentist for two reasons. One is it's painful, and two, it's costly. And, you know, and the reality is that if you don't go to the dentist and get the annual tooth cleaning, and you don't get the cavities filled when you need to, and that's a minor amount of drilling, you end up with a root canal. And when you end up with a root canal, it's a lot more painful, and it's, you know, it's 10 or 20 times more expensive than the filling would have been. And it's understandable that people don't want to go to the dentist, and it's understand that politicians don't want to ask taxpayers for the money, but we're getting to a point where not doing what needs to be done is putting at risk an awful lot of things. And I was very impressed by the real estate and economic development and local government and the retail trade thing. So I think that we've got a lot of good ideas. The question is whether or not we're smart enough to do anything with them. And my dad was not a high school graduate, and he was quite proud of that, and so was I. His attitude was that you needed a 2-before to get a donkey's attention, and you probably only needed to get his attention once. I think that one of the things we need to consider is whether or not the legislature would be assisted with 2-before. And the 2-before that comes to mind to me is simply impounding all the sales tax on car sales and on services for cars until such time as our state system is back in a state of good repair, which we know from Bob it's not been more than 30 years. And so I urge you to take a look at this, and if you have any ideas, let me know. The website badroads.us is in my ownership, but it's not yet up and running. But I hope that you will consider giving some input, and if an initiative is not the right way to go, if it doesn't assist the legislature in focusing their attention next year, then we need to think of something else, because what we are doing now is not working. And I welcome input from anybody else that has it, and then we will be dismissed. Todd?
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for your leadership in this, keeping you know, this issue in front of everybody. My impression is that sort of like 3 parts to the solution. One is identifying the problem, which you've done, but identifying it specifically, what is the actual cost of the solution. The second part is specifying the outcome. I'm in the private sector. Results are all that really matter. It's not process. If we don't succeed, then we fail. So if you identify what is the outcome, and that's bringing the roads back to good condition and then being clear about what that means. In my experience in public policy, if you define the outcomes, then you get the agreement on that. People tend to agree on the outcomes more than they agree on the method to get there. But if you get agreement on the outcome at the outset, and you help do the work to identify the scope of the problem, which is how much would it cost to do that, then all that's remaining is how do you come up with the resources to achieve that outcome? It's sort of similar to trying to finish the 405 master plan. We've all agree on it now, so it's just really about coming up with the resources to get it done. This is what you're proposing here is one of the methodologies to do that, or to fund that outcome. But maybe if you be specific about what that outcome is and what the scope of the fiscal note is on it. I think that is 2/3 of the way there. And then you can have the discussions, the remaining discussions on how do you best accomplish that outcome.
And I've been remiss. I very much appreciate the fact that Senator Huff's staff is here today, and I'd be most interested if Misha has anything she wants to say to us.
Yeah, I've mentioned to a couple of folks that it's pretty difficult in this climate to get, like as you said, legislators to vote on taxes, especially when the people have just spoken and said no more, and they don't trust what we're trying to tell them. And I totally get that. And I'm actually working right now, I was telling folks earlier, with a constituent who doesn't understand the EV fee increases to create parity with the gas tax. And he's saying, why don't you tax the gas guzzling vehicles? Why are you taxing us? And I had to sit back and say, well, no, we actually are taxing them through gas taxes, and it's actually not quite sufficient. So we got to find resources, and that's not what they want to hear. So we really need your help. Like you said, put pressure on other legislators, keep talking to the community. We need more resources, and people don't want to hear us say that. So that's one thing I got to say. Also, Senator Hobbs will keep working towards Forward Washington, like I told Mike Bloomblum, but the people both in his caucus and in the other caucus, last time around, they had a hard time voting for it, and this time around, it's going to be even harder. So.
Why do you think it's hard?
Because of what just happened this past election. I think they're going to be challenged by taking another vote on taxes when people just said no more. Yeah?
Misha, I appreciate that you are willing to come to these events. You were at the ACES roundtable a week and a half ago, and it's great to see that you have an interest in listening to the various sides of the transportation issue. And, to address your constituents' concern, well, if their electric vehicle isn't driving on the road, then I guess they don't have to pay any road usage fees. But the fact of the matter is that in some ways we don't have a lot of parity in taxing for roads in this country. So trucks actually cause the majority of pavement damage, and yet there has not been an increase in the diesel fuel excise tax on the federal level. And of course, every tax increase is paid for by you and me. If we increase taxes on ExxonMobil, they're going to increase the price of whatever they're selling, and you and I are still going to have to pay. So taxes are not this magic thing, but understanding road user fees and understanding the intent of the 18th Amendment, I think, is something that the public will get behind, because I believe that, and this is not just from reading the newspaper, it comes from browsing through Facebook posts with WashDOT and Sound Transit and reading some of the comments that people have. And some people aren't very nice because they're upset. But public sentiment right now is comprised of two things. Number one, Sound Transit lied to us, and we can argue whether they intended to, or they wanted to, or they like doing that, or whatever, but the point is that's how the public feels. And so as policy analysts, policy makers, people who advise people making policy, we should understand that. But the second component of it really, and this comes from my understanding of public sentiment, is that people want the congested roads to be fixed. And people are not stupid. Despite what some of the legislators in Olympia, the way that they treat us, their constituents aren't idiots. Their constituents know that if you add a lane to a freeway, it's going to reduce congestion, because that's what WashDOT did when they opened the peak shoulder use lane on I-405, and it reduced the congestion in the general purpose lanes by something like 40% by various measures, travel time, whatever. And I think that the people of Washington State will support another nickel or TPA style package if they know two things. Number one, it's going to deliver these projects by this timeline. And every package we voted on in the past 2 decades has promised to finish the North Spokane Freeway, and it's promised to finish SR 167 in Tacoma, and neither one of those projects has been completed yet. And they will support it if they recognize that there's going to be some legislative accountability for the Department of Transportation. What happens is that, and this is our natural state as people in the Pacific Northwest, everybody has to be happy. And so instead of actually addressing problems, this bill is going to say, well, congestion is bad, but we'll give people more alternative transportation that they've already shown preference for not using. Now, I myself am a transit user. I want Sound Transit to actually operate its bus system effectively and not stop the light rail train outside of the Beacon Hill Tunnel and tell me we can't go anywhere for 20 minutes while I'm trying to get to the airport, right? You know, I'd like the escalators to work, for example, but that's too much to ask. So the key is that if we want the public to support this, we recognize they're already sick and tired of congestion. That's just not coming out in the media necessarily. And what they're telling us with 976 is, A, and you're right, we don't trust these agencies, but they're also saying, we don't want this to be the solution. So we need to come up with a solution that resonates with people. And looking at TPA and looking at nickel in 2002 and 2005, and looking at the 425 projects that were listed, I think that is how you get people to stand behind a legislative agenda that increases transportation funding, because the perception out there right now, along with everything else, is that WashDOT is collecting the second highest motor fuel excise tax in the nation, and they don't appear to actually be fixing anything. I don't know where that money is going, but it isn't going to highway expansion.
Well, I'd like Ken, and then Vic.
I was just wondering if there was anybody here from DOT, because I drove up here and was pretty impressed with the conditions on I-90 and the temporary bridges in the middle, so they could redo the bridge decks on the bridges in the Ellensburg area. And it looks like they're doing some grinding.
Yeah.
And maybe they're doing their own grinding.
And
Washington? Yeah.
Ken, I should have said this earlier in the program. We have always had 2 or 3 or even 4 RAs at these meetings. The reason they're not here today is because they're having their own summit of how they're going to deal with the reduced funding for maintenance this year and for preservation next year. And as you know, I was going to say districts, the regions that used to be districts have been instructed that they're to substantially cut back on snowplow operator hiring for the fall and winter because they don't have the money. And they're over there talking now about how do they go from their plans for 5 or 6 paving crews in each of the regions to 1 or 2 paving crews in each of the regions next year. And this has to do in key part with the Garvey bond refunding that was done to the federal government this year and effectively reduced the existing level of preservation and maintenance funding, not to mention the fact that we haven't added anything after Millard told us there was another $700 million. But Vic, you had a question.
Well, I have a thought. I've heard it at least 3 or 4 times today that Washington has the highest or second highest gas tax in the nation. And somehow that's converted into we're spending more than others. Not true. The reason that we have the highest gas tax is because we have the 18th Amendment, and our gas tax is protected and goes to the highway system. That is not true in other states around the nation. Other states, and I'm going to use Texas as an example. We had a conference in Austin, and we asked them, I said, you know, your gas tax is 2/3 of what Washington is, but you've got highways that come out your ears. How is that working? Oh, well, a few years ago, we passed the idea that the sales tax for the sales of new vehicles is going to go into the transportation account. Sales tax on new vehicles is an enormous hunk of money, which of course we use to fund schools, all kinds of other things, but we don't divert general fund money to the highway system, and therefore we rely almost exclusively on the gas tax. And I get upset when I hear the excuse of not raising the gas tax as the reason that we can't fund our system more with the fund that goes to solve the problem that we're trying to solve, which is...
Amen.
So I'm just trying to put that out, is that that's not an acceptable excuse not to raise the gas tax. It's just that we're high on the nation. It's the big picture.
And I'm not saying we should.
I know, but it keeps coming up, but I just wanted to mention.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that. Janet, you had a question.
What would make people more happy than to have the tolls removed on 405 and have them all general purpose?
Happiness is a difficult subject. Who wants to take that up?
I'm not sure we had to be at peace with higher gas tax because I know the value of it. I also think that using general purpose revenues is a good way to go. We have a regional transportation investment district opportunity that's been authorized that we should revisit. But I wanted to share a little history, particularly for you, as to how we had a little different outcome in a previous effort to repeal major transportation funding package, and that was after the 9.5-cent gas tax increase was passed as the largest gas tax increase in the state's history back then. We were able to defend that increase because the project selection criteria was solid. And this goes back to Senator Jim Horn's efforts in 2002 and 3 package. The approach that he used was rather than, quote, to peanut butter it around and keep everybody happy but not do much good, they decided to set up a system of measurements for outcomes on these projects. And so you had these performance standards that the legislature agreed upon before they talked about the projects. And then my understanding of the way it was is then they agreed on that, and they figured how much they were going to go for the tax increase and what the total amount of revenue was. Then you run the projects through that filter that everybody agreed on, and some of them are going to be above the line, some are below the line, but you all agreed that the ones above the line are the ones that offer the most benefit cost. And then that's it. And then the legislators who get it can obviously go, say I brought home the bacon, but the ones that didn't get it can go back to their constituents and say, our project, I know it's really important to us, but it didn't make the cut. However, by funding these other ones, then it moves up in line. And that was a successful formula. That process was largely maintained for the project selection for 2005, where we got a 9.5-cent gas tax. Well, there were a conservative anti-tax group that went after that, and we had to defend it. The way we were able to defend that and the voters retained that gas tax was those of us in the campaign to retain it, divided the state up into 6 or 8 districts, so it's a little ways back, but we basically said, these are the projects that this tax funds in your community. And the question you have is whether or not you want to have these funded, or whether you'd rather take away the funding and save yourself a few bucks. And voters said, well, you know what, those projects actually are worthwhile. We will retain the largest gas tax increase in the state's history to do it. And that's how those things got funded. And then back to my thing about this virtuous cycle, by having that funding, then we were like shovel ready under the Tiger grants under the Obama administration. We got accelerated funding for the accelerated construction of some of the next increments of the 405 master plan and other things, because we had skin in the game, we had an act together, we were moving forward, and then that leveraged other things, and it just kind of builds on itself. So by having worthwhile, defensible projects, you can get and maintain the funding for it. And just lastly on this 11.9 cents, which was the last one, driver, it costs you half a penny a mile. You know, big deal. You know, the tolls on 405 cost you about $1.25 a mile. And that's kind of the only option we're giving WashDOT because we're not giving them the gas tax revenues. But I would much rather pay another penny a mile, you know, or 5 cents a mile than have to pay $1.25 a mile to drive on the same section of road. So I share that history with you because there's, you know, what gets said and then how people actually choose to act in terms of funding and then retaining the tax increases for it. This last one, I think people understood it was, you know, this big car tab thing was very problematic and there's kind of a turkey. But we also have a history of passing these programs, retaining them, and doing what we stand for. So have courage.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
I don't think most of the taxpayers understand that a large percentage of the last 15 cents or so of gas tax is not available for anything except paying off the bonds for the next 30 years.
Well, that's a concern. I mean, it's complicated, but I think so. Give the voters credit for understanding some of this stuff. We might not be able to articulate all the nuances of the challenges we have by overly leveraging, you know, borrowing, be overly indebted on this and that. But we all kind of understand that some reform needs to be done, and you know, so it's the responsibility of whether it's Sound Transit and they're on elected board to do a fair valuation, or whether it's, you know, the legislature or the local governments to take care of what you've got. I think the voters said you've got to do a better job with what we've entrusted you with, and by the way, we're going to scale that back until you do a better job and perform better. So that's the point. Is we have those outcomes that have broad agreement on, and we do perform to those standards, then there's a long history of the taxpayer stepping up and making additional investments in the transportation system.
And if we accept Tim Iman's analysis, at least in part, that the reason it was so easy for him to pass this initiative, despite $5 million being invested to defeat it, was because there's a deepening distrust of politicians. It seems to me that anything that we can do that will encourage optimization of our transportation dollar investments so that taxpayers and motorists know that they're getting better value for the money, then that is going to encourage them to want to participate in that process because they're the beneficiaries. I mean, driving back home on bad roads today, wherever you're headed, to one degree or another, is not as pleasant as driving on good roads. I mean, it's just reality. And I think that we've got a lot of good data. The question is whether or not we're smart enough to do something with it. And I hope we can continue this conversation. So I'm gonna help clean up this room. Scott, do you need the last word?
No, I don't need the last word, but I want to say that Vic and Todd have raised some important points, and there's some things that I hope that we will take away from this meeting today, which is that number one, when we say WashDOT, we're not talking about the rank and file engineers and planners that, you know, are generally carrying out their obligations to the public as professional engineers and certified planners. But what we're really talking about is the institutional direction that's taking place as a result of Governor Inslee's choices and his administration and the people that have been put in place at WashDOT. And what they have done is they have changed WashDOT's strategic priorities and direction. And this is only going to be fixed either by replacing the people in charge or by an act of the legislature. And so, and Vic is absolutely right. Our gas taxes are higher than some states, not just because WSDOT has issues with spending money efficiently and delivers projects consistently at a much higher cost than comparable states, but it's also because we have a huge debt service that we have to attend to. And it's also because the Department of Transportation is being forced to spend money for the Department of Ecology. I support fish passage, but we have to recognize that the legislature is going to continue to force WSDOT to take on responsibilities and costs that have nothing to do with the preservation of the state highway system. And until we find a way to get some of those things funded by other agencies, which is a bigger haul for the legislature, then we're going to continue to see an erosion in what our gas tax receipts are capable of buying for.